Start with the concept of death. It is the one thing we all have in common. When someone passes away, we don't just leave them there. We have rituals, funerals, graveyards. For the longest time, anthropologists drew a very firm line in the dirt. They said, this side is animal, this side is human, and the dividing line is how we treat our dead. Caring for the deceased, placing them in a specific, protected spot, maybe even leaving a flower or a tool with them, that requires abstract thought. It requires a brain big enough to understand tomorrow, to feel grief, and to imagine an afterlife. It's always been considered a hallmark of our own species, Homo sapiens, and maybe our heavy-browed cousins, the Neanderthals. But what if I told you that deep beneath the South African savanna, at the end of a cave system so narrow and terrifying that it literally requires you to exhale just to squeeze through, scientists found something that shattered that entire timeline? What if a mysterious, small-brained creature, a ghost in our family tree, was burying its dead hundreds of thousands of years before we even figured out how to do it? Grab your headlamp and try not to feel claustrophobic, because we are going deep underground to investigate one of the biggest, most fiercely debated mysteries in human evolution, the astonishing secrets of the Rising Star Cave. Our story actually starts like a classic adventure movie. The year is 2013. Two recreational cavers, Stephen Tucker and Rick Hunter, are spending their weekend exploring the Rising Star Cave system in the Cradle of Humankind. Now, the Cradle of Humankind is a World Heritage Site in South Africa that is absolute gold for paleoanthropologists. It's a sprawling landscape dotted with limestone caves that have perfectly preserved the fossils of our ancient ancestors for millions of years. But Tucker and Hunter weren't scientists. They were just guys who loved squeezing into tight, pitch-black places for fun, which is definitely a very specific kind of hobby. They were mapping a well-known section of the cave when they decided to push a little further. They climbed up a jagged ridge of rock, ominously named the Dragon's Back. At the top, they found a tiny vertical crack dropping down into the abyss. And when I say tiny, I mean comical. It's a vertical shaft called the chute, and at its narrowest point, it is barely 7.5 inches wide. That's less than 20 centimeters. Picture the width of a standard iPad. Now picture trying to force your entire human body down a jagged rocky tube that size, for 40 feet, in the dark. Somehow, they did it. They contorted themselves, scraped their way down the chute, and dropped into a previously untouched cavern, completely sealed off from the outside world. This was the Naledi chamber, which translates to the Chamber of Stars. But they didn't find stars down there. As their headlamps swept across the dusty limestone floor, the beams caught something pale: bones. Not just one or two. The floor was practically littered with them. Skulls, jawbones, ribs, tiny delicate finger bones. And these didn't look like baboon bones, or antelope bones that had washed in during a flood. They looked distinctly, eerily human. Tucker and Hunter knew they had stumbled onto something massive. They snapped some blurry photos, climbed back up that nightmare chute, and got word to Lee Berger, a highly prominent paleoanthropologist at the University of the Witwatersrand. When Berger saw those photos, his heart probably skipped a few beats. He knew immediately that these were hominin bones, the ancestors or close relatives of modern humans. But there was a massive logistical problem. Berger is a broad-shouldered guy. There was absolutely no way he was fitting down a 7.5-inch chute. So, he did what anyone in the 21st century does when they have a highly specific, bizarre problem. He put an ad on social media. He sent out a call for scientists who were not only trained in archaeology, but who were also skinny, not claustrophobic, and willing to drop everything to fly to South Africa and squeeze down a terrifying rock tube. The response was overwhelming. He selected a team of incredibly brave women who became known as the Underground Astronauts. Over the course of 3 weeks, they squeezed down that terrifying chute day after day, working in incredibly cramped, humid conditions, slowly and meticulously excavating the fossils. They brought up bags upon bags of bones. More than 1,500 fossil pieces were recovered in that first expedition alone, representing at least 15 different individuals, from infants to the elderly. It was the single largest discovery of fossil hominins ever made on the African continent. But as the bones were laid out on tables in the laboratory, the mystery only deepened. Because these bones didn't make any sense. They were a bizarre mashup of features that shouldn't exist on the same creature, meaning they were looking at an entirely new species that was about to turn everything we thought we knew completely upside down. Imagine standing in a high-tech laboratory, staring at a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces seem to have come from three completely different boxes. That is exactly what Lee Berger and his team were dealing with. As they meticulously assembled these newly found skeletons, they realized they were staring into the face of an entirely new species of ancient human. They named it Homo naledi, paying tribute to the cave itself. Naledi means star in the local Sotho language. But Homo naledi was an evolutionary Frankenstein's monster, and I mean that in the best possible way. If you looked only at their skulls, you would think you were looking at something incredibly primitive. Their brains were tiny. We're talking maybe a third the size of your brain, roughly the volume of an average orange. Their shoulders were shrugged high and narrow, built exactly like an ape's, and their fingers were extremely curved, perfectly adapted for gripping branches and swinging through the canopy. If you just looked at the top half, you'd guess this creature swung through the primordial forests millions and millions of years ago. But then, you look down. Homo naledi had long, slender legs built for striding confidently across the open savanna. And their feet? Their feet were almost indistinguishable from yours or mine. If a Homo naledi walked across a muddy beach today, you would just think a modern human with a slightly small shoe size had strolled by. They were a walking contradiction, a creature that spent its days walking upright on the ground like us, but likely retreated to the safety of the trees at night. Because of that tiny orange-sized brain and those tree-climbing fingers, the initial assumption was that Homo naledi was incredibly ancient. Scientists figured these fossils had to be at least 2.5, maybe even 3 million years old. They thought they were looking at one of the very first members of our genus, a ghost, from the absolute dawn of humanity. It took a few years of painstakingly complex geological dating to get a firm age on the fossils. They tested the teeth, they tested the radioactive isotopes in the cave, they double and triple checked their math. When the results finally came back in 2017, they sent shockwaves through the scientific community. These bones weren't 3 million years old. They weren't even 1 million years old. The Homo naledi fossils in the Rising Star Cave were dated to between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a second. 300,000 years ago might sound like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, it is practically yesterday. This was a blockbuster revelation, because it meant that while Homo naledi was scrambling around the South African landscape, the very first early members of our own species, Homo sapiens, were also evolving on the exact same continent. We weren't alone. Picture yourself as an early hunter-gatherer, walking through the tall grass, and locking eyes with a creature that looks somewhat human, walks like a human, but has a face and a brain straight out of the distant past. It completely rewrote the timeline of human evolution, proving that nature was experimenting with many different ways to be human all at the same time. But the absolute shock of their age quickly took a back seat to a much more pressing, almost terrifying question. A classic locked room mystery. How on earth did at least 15 of these individuals end up at the bottom of a pitch-black, suffocatingly tight cavern? Remember, the Naledi chamber is hidden past the jagged dragon's back and down that agonizing 7.5-inch chute. It is completely isolated. Geologists studied the cave extensively and confirmed that there was never another, easier entrance that simply collapsed over time. The chute was always the only way in. So, how did a nursery of infants, alongside full-grown adults and the elderly, all wind up in the absolute dark? If this were a crime scene, detectives would start ruling things out. Did they live in the cave and just die naturally? No. There are no stone tools, no signs of domestic life, no animal bones from leftover meals. Nobody was living down there. Did a sudden flood wash their bodies deep into the cave system? Geologists ruled that out too. The sediments showed no signs of violent water flow, and the bones weren't tumbled or shattered like they'd been dragged by a current. Did a predator like a giant hyena or a big cat drag them in for dinner? Again, Zero evidence. Not a single tooth mark or gnaw scrape was found on any of the over 1,500 bones. All the natural, accidental explanations were evaporating one by one. And that left Lee Berger and his team staring at a single, deeply unsettling possibility. One that would threaten to turn everything we knew about human intelligence completely inside out. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how highly improbable, must be the truth. And the truth Lee Berger's team proposed was absolutely staggering. They concluded that Homo naledi, a creature with a brain the size of a piece of fruit, was deliberately and repeatedly carrying its dead deep underground to dispose of them. Think about the immense physical and mental effort that requires. They didn't just toss the bodies into a ditch and walk away. They would have had to carry their deceased through the winding, treacherous upper tunnels of the rising star system, scramble up the jagged slope of the dragon's back, and then intentionally drop or place the bodies down that impossibly narrow vertical chute. And they didn't just do it once. The sheer number of individuals found, spanning multiple generations, implies this was a continuous, established practice. A cultural tradition of the dead. For decades, paleoanthropologists have operated on a concept we can call the cognitive Rubicon. It's the idea that you need a certain engine capacity, a specific volume of brain matter, before a species can cross the threshold into complex, abstract behaviors. Dealing with a corpse in such a highly structured way was supposed to be way past that finish line. It implies recognizing that the individual is gone, understanding that the body will decay, and having the social cohesion to organize a highly difficult, dangerous mission just to hide the remains. We arrogantly assumed you needed a big, modern human brain to care about mortality. Homo naledi was suddenly forcing us to ask, what if you don't? What if empathy, or at least a complex social awareness of death, is much older and much more hardwired into our family tree than we ever guessed? But if you accept the burial hypothesis, you immediately crash into a massive, terrifying logistical wall. The Naledi chamber, and the treacherous path leading to it, is located in what cave scientists call the deep dark zone. There is no twilight here. There is absolute, suffocating, pitch-black darkness. Your eyes will never adjust because there is literally zero ambient light to capture. So, how on earth did a small-brained hominin navigate a deadly, jagged subterranean labyrinth while carrying a corpse? They would have needed light, artificial light, which means Homo naledi must have had the controlled use of fire. Picture yourself in that scenario. It is 300,000 years ago. The sun sets over the African savanna. Instead of hiding in the trees to escape the leopards and giant hyenas, your troop huddles around a crackling campfire. A member of your group has died. Instead of abandoning the body to the scavengers, someone ignites a bundle of dry grass or branches, creating a rudimentary torch. You carry the flickering flame into the mouth of the cavern. You navigate the slick, damp limestone. You coordinate the transport of dead weight up a steep underground ridge, your shadows dancing wildly against the cave walls, all while making sure your only source of light doesn't extinguish, leaving you all entombed in the dark forever. The ability to create and control fire is one of the most defining technological leaps in human history. It cooks our food, it keeps the monsters at bay, and it pushes back the night. Up until this point, we thought only the heavy hitters of human evolution, like Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and our own ancestors, were smart enough to tame the flame. If Berger's hypothesis was right, Homo naledi wasn't just stumbling around in the dark. They were wielding fire as a tool for a complex underworld ritual. Now, some scientists immediately tried to pump the brakes on the excitement. They argued that maybe this wasn't a burial in the spiritual sense. Maybe it was just disposal, a sort of ancient sanitation system. If a body rots near where you sleep, it smells terrible, and it attracts highly dangerous predators to your front door. So maybe dropping them down a dark hole was just the prehistoric equivalent of taking out the trash. But even if you strip away the romance and the emotion, the sheer spatial awareness required to memorize a cave route, the technological leap to use fire, and the immense physical teamwork needed to carry a body through a nightmare obstacle course, it is still an absolute earthquake in our understanding of early human intelligence. And the team at Rising Star was about to make a new series of claims that would make the fire hypothesis look incredibly tame, setting the stage for one of the most vicious scientific brawls of the decade. In 2023, the Rising Star team dropped a bombshell that turned a simmering debate into an all-out scientific war. It wasn't just about bodies resting on the cave floor anymore. The team claimed they had found actual graves, not natural depressions, but shallow pits deliberately dug into the earth. The bodies inside weren't just tossed haphazardly. They appeared to be curled up in a fetal position, carefully placed, and then purposefully covered back up with dirt. To dig a grave in this cramped, rocky space, in the pitch black, using primitive tools or just your bare hands, is a massive step up from simply dropping a body down a hole. It implies deep care. But hold on to your hats, because it gets crazier. The team told the world to look up from the dirt and focus on the walls. Right above these purported graves, etched deeply into the incredibly hard dolomite rock, were markings. Deep, cross-hatched lines and geometric shapes that look remarkably like modern hashtags or tic-tac-toe boards. In the world of archaeology, discovering geometric patterns is basically a screaming alarm bell for symbolic thought. It is early art. It is a way of saying, I was here, and this place has meaning. If Homo Naledi made these engravings, they weren't just disposing of their dead, they were creating monuments. They were turning a dark, terrifying cavern into a sacred space. Now, normally, when a scientist finds something this world-shattering, they write a highly technical paper, submit it to a prestigious journal, and wait months or even years for an anonymous panel of other experts to tear it apart, verify the data, and approve it. This process is called peer review. You can think of it as the bouncer at the club of scientific truth. But Berger's team did something highly unconventional and highly controversial. They published their preliminary findings online and almost simultaneously announced these massive discoveries through a slick, highly publicized documentary on a major streaming platform. They essentially bypassed the traditional bouncer and took the party straight to the general public. The broader scientific community absolutely erupted, and they were not clapping. Critics accused the Rising Star team of prioritizing media hype over rigorous science. Prominent paleoanthropologists took one look at the photos of the so-called graves and said, "Hold on a minute. Those just look like natural depressions in the cave floor, where water pooled and bodies naturally settled into a slump over time." They argued that a shallow dip in the dirt doesn't automatically mean someone intentionally excavated a hole. As for the hashtag engravings on the walls, the pushback was even fiercer. Skeptics pointed out a glaring flaw. Right now, there is absolutely no reliable way to accurately date a scratch on a rock. Sure, there are marks on the wall, but how on earth do we know Homo Naledi made them? Could they have been carved by completely different, larger-brained humans, like our own ancestors, who wandered into the cave tens of thousands of years later? Could they be the claw marks of a desperate, trapped animal? Could they even be the accidental scrapes from modern recreational cavers dragging their heavy gear through tight spaces? Without hard, physical dates tying those specific scratches to the exact time period when Homo Naledi was alive, critics argued that claiming they were ancient cave art was a massive, irresponsible leap of faith. Even the fire hypothesis came under heavy attack. Critics demanded to see the receipts. If Homo Naledi was constantly carrying blazing torches into this cave for generations, where are the massive piles of charcoal? Where are the heavily scorched rocks or the thick layers of soot on the ceiling? The debate hit an absolute fever pitch, boiling down to one fundamental, philosophical question. What actually counts as proof when you are trying to reconstruct the minds of creatures who have been dead for 300 millennia? When do bold, imaginative leaps that push the boundaries of how we view the past cross the line into science fiction? But here is the incredible thing. Regardless of who ultimately wins the bitter battle over those alleged graves and geometric engravings, the very existence of Homo Naledi has already permanently shattered our oldest, most comfortable origin story. For generations, if you opened a biology textbook, you saw the exact same illustration. The march of progress, a hunched-over, ape-like creature on the far left, slowly standing up straighter and straighter, getting a little taller, growing a slightly larger head, until it triumphantly becomes us, the modern human, on the right. We loved that picture because it made us the inevitable pinnacle of evolution. It made us the grand finale of a long, deliberate journey. The bones pulled from the Rising Star cave proved, once and for all, that this march of progress is a complete myth. Human evolution was never a neat, straight ladder. It was a chaotic, wildly branching bush, a braided stream. Nature wasn't marching toward a specific goal. It was throwing every possible evolutionary combination at the wall to see what stuck. You had big-brained hominins with heavier, clumsier builds. You had tiny-brained hominins with highly modern feet and tree-climbing fingers. Just a few 100,000 years ago, the Earth was practically crowded with entirely different kinds of humanity, all trying to survive, all sharing the exact same African landscapes, and perhaps even crossing paths in the tall savanna grass. And that forces us to look in the mirror and ask a deeply humbling question about ourselves. For over a century, we have tied our entire definition of humanity to the sheer physical volume of our brains. We assumed that you needed a massive cerebral cortex to feel grief, to care for your community, to look at a dark, terrifying cave and decide that it was the proper, sacred resting place for someone you loved. But if a creature with a brain a third the size of yours could navigate the deep dark zone, if they could master fire and recognize their own mortality, then we have fundamentally misunderstood how intelligence works. After all, we know today that a crow can solve complex multi-step puzzles, and an octopus can use tools to escape a locked container. Why wouldn't a bipedal, highly social primate have its own deep, complex inner world, regardless of its skull size? Maybe it is not the size of the engine that matters, but how the wires inside are connected. The Naledi chamber remains one of the darkest, most tantalizing frontiers in modern science. Deep underground, locked away from the sun, the bones of Homo Naledi are silently waiting for the next generation of fearless underground astronauts to squeeze through the chute, dust off the limestone, and bring more answers out into the light. Until then, the ultimate truth of their rituals, their minds, and their final moments belongs entirely to the dark. So, I turn the question over to you. What do you think is really going on at the bottom of the Rising Star Cave? Did an ancient, small-brained species of human conquer the night with fire and invent the sacred ritual of burial long before we did? Or is our own deeply imaginative modern brain simply projecting human meaning onto the natural, random settling of dirt and stone? I want to read your best theories down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the prehistoric underworld, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with a fellow history nerd, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out when we dig up the mysteries of the past. Keep questioning everything, and I will see you in the next one.